Hello, and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll learn about beer brewing in Minnesota. But first, joining us now is a professor from UND, Melissa Jelstad, and a professor from the University of Maryland, Danielle Shelver. Ladies, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Well, before we get started, the folks may want to know a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about your background and
I am actually North Dakotan. Grew up on a farm out by Velva and started learning Norwegian here at Concordia College and went on to get my master's and PhD in Scandinavian language and literature out at the University of Washington in Seattle. Studied abroad at the University of Oslo and University of Bergen and taught in Washington and Indiana before I took a research position in Norway and moved back to the University of North Dakota to become the Norwegian professor there in 2008.
Okay.
And I live in Rugby with my husband, who's a retired Marine. After many years in the Marine Corps, we decided to move back to his hometown, which is Rugby. And I recently edited a book. It's a literary anthology written by people from the Rugby area, and in that book are two poems translated by Melissa Jelstad. My connection to UND is that I'm an alum there and I'm working on my PhD there, and I am a professor at the University of Maryland's online branch, which serves the United States military mostly. So that's how I work there from Rugby. So. Okay,
well, with all that said, you are here to talk about a book that you translated, The War with the Sioux, Norwegians Against the Indians, 1862-1863. Now, as we get into that, the book was originally authored by
Carl Jakob Skarstein, Norwegian historian who had worked on that as part of his graduate research and published this book in 2005 for a more general reading audience. And Danielle had earlier received a copy of it, or had a copy of it, and approached me about it at UND, and we decided, after I read it, I was really struck by Skarstein's voice in there and how he's able to retell the story that's often very chaotic and dispersed about the U.S.-Dakota War and weave it into a narrative that spanned both 1862's events and into 1863 from Minnesota to Dakota Territory. So I was really taken by the voice, and we decided to jump in and translate it and bring it to an American audience.
Well, with that said, though, what is the book about? Obviously, the Dakota War, 1862 and 1863, but it's not about famous people, you were telling me.
Right. The Richard Rothfuss, who wrote the historical introduction for the English edition, calls this book the best book on the U.S.-Dakota War. And that's largely because it is not great man history. This is about regular folks. And this is a book that tells the story of the Dakota War from the ethnic lens of two different people. So you have two different ethnicities. You have Norwegian immigrants and you have Dakota natives. And it is that sort of interweaving and this telling of the story from two perspectives that are so often lost. There were numerous immigrants involved in this war, and incidentally, we're talking about Carl Jakob Skarstein in the Civil War as well. One of his other books is on Norwegian immigrants in the Civil War. So he's very interested in military history.
Was this book hard to translate? Were there certain words that you had to get consulted on, I guess?
He writes it, as I mentioned, the tone is really fun and good and easy to follow, very readable. But of course there are, 1800s terminology about clothing and about military tactics and weaponry that we had to do some research on. There were some individual words. Danielle can talk about a couple of them too. A couple nuts to crack of the variety of Norwegian dialects, especially as the soldiers were recounting them and telling them in their journals and stories, and then had a mix of the dialect plus maybe some of their Norwenglish as they'd started to be living in the United States and adding American words in there, and resolving some of those required some friends who were native speakers and a variety of scholars as we were looking to get the best meaning into English.
Yeah, we relied on our contacts in Norway, and in particular, I have a couple of cousins who are scholars in their own right over there in Norway. And there was one particular phrase, la seg verve, which is, it literally means to allow oneself to be recruited, but it also means to enlist. And so we wrestled with this. Well, how do we use this? Do we go with the literal translation or do we go with enlist? So in speaking with folks in Norway, we came to realize that these two meanings do both exist in this one phrase. And when we used, for example, to allow oneself to be enlisted, we took contextual cues. So for example, you'd use that when someone felt pressure to enlist from the outside. So financial pressures or community pressures or someone calling you a coward. That's when we used allowing oneself to be enlisted or to be recruited. But we use the active, voluntary, enlisting or joining up when people were out of an internal drive wanting to join up to fight in the Civil War, which of course is going on at the same time, or because they wanted to defend the settlers in Minnesota.
Some of the voices, maybe I'll just read a quick passage. Some of the voices are really interesting, and this is a story about Matthias Fjellhaugen. And he was 50 years old, I'll just quote, newly widowed for the second time with 5 children to care for alone. When he allowed himself to be recruited, despite these things, it was likely first and foremost because of money. This was his rationale for enlisting, and here's a quote from Matthias then. The Indians had to be driven away so that we could live there in peace, and the government had plenty to do down south in the Civil War, so we got to go. I was able to send home $13 per month. I personally got food and clothing. Should anything have happened to me? Well, our father probably had a reason for that too. So that's an example of some of the voices and the individual stories that come out in this text.
Yeah. Well, what kind of training did you have to do to translate, or is there training for that?
As a graduate student, I actually took a literary translation course from one of the best literary translators in Scandinavian to American fiction right now, and have done a little bit of literary translation. Danielle mentioned a couple of the poetry pieces I've had published, but I've primarily worked in nonfiction translation, in art history, and then in this. So it's getting into both, of course, needing to have the language expertise, but also being able to articulate well in the language you're translating into, to be able to tell a good story and make it compelling so it doesn't read like a translation. It reads like it's an American text, American English text in this case.
Okay.
Well, my background's much less formal than that. As a European historian, you have to be able to read sources in other languages. So I can read a broad range of languages, and this came from I actually had tremendous training in high school. I went to a high school that offered 4 languages, 4 years of them all, and I took Latin, French, and German in high school, and then some French and Russian in college. And what that did was give me a broad kind of map of European languages in general, so that it allows me to learn to read languages fairly quickly. It doesn't mean that I can speak them, but I can learn to read them fairly quickly. So, yeah.
And it was a good pairing, just add between then and, so you've heard Danielle's history as a European historian, and how her scholarly perspectives matched with mine, made us a very well paired team to be able to bring out the best of this text from an interdisciplinary perspective.
With all that said, how long did it take to translate this book?
Danielle brought it to my attention in the spring of 2014, and we started on the translation then, worked pretty intensely over the summer and fall, had a pretty solid draft by spring of 15 that we were working with the editor and publisher on, and published over the summer, and it came out here in the beginning of fall of 2015, so about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the publication process was really collaborative. UND's Bill Caraher replicated all of Skarstein's maps. Skarstein has a whole bunch of original maps in his book, and Bill Caraher spent quite a bit of time replicating those. And we also have the historical introduction for the English version written by Richard Rothfuss, and then Dakota Goodhouse wrote just a tremendous piece on the Apple Creek fight. I'm sorry, I think I have that wrong. And drawing on Dakota sources that are so often ignored. So, and that's also in this book.
Okay. Well, let's move on here to why is this conflict largely forgotten? Is it because it was during the Civil War?
Yes, there are 2 reasons. First, I think for a lot of Americans, the Indian Wars are just sort of kind of all subsumed, into each other, and so they get lost in the Sioux War and the Nez Perce War and the Ute War, and all of these individual events like the Battle of Little Bighorn. So I think that's one of the reasons. They just are lost in this kind of mass. The other reason, though, is that it happened during the Civil War, and it was such an event of such tremendous. It just overwhelmed the country that anything that happened during that period is kind of lost in it. Yeah.
Sure. Well, you got a couple of names here that. What about Colonel Sibley and General Sully? What can you tell about 2 of the key characters? I think.
Well, I will talk
And they're not
about
characters, I'm sorry, they're names in the conflict.
Well, some might say they're characters. One of the great things about Skarstein's book is that, yes, he does discuss the great men, but he also gets at the great men on the native side of this. But as to Sibley, he was the first governor of Minnesota, and he was really an ideal person to lead the defense in that, while he really didn't have much in the way of military background, he was an outdoorsman, he was very physical, he was very well respected, and he had good relations with Native Americans. In fact, he and Little Crow, who were enemies on the battlefield, had been hunting partners before. So he was also very cautious. He was unwilling to commit his men until he knew that he had enough men and he knew that they were well enough armed. This earned him quite a bit of criticism from people in the areas under attack, understandably, but at the same time this was effective, and so when he engaged, he was effective at it. As to Sully, Skarstein is not as interested in Sully, and I'm not quite sure why, but primarily he deals with him as in terms of his military engagements. Sully was the son of an artist and was himself a bit of a watercolor artist. He was also a Civil War leader, and he's primarily associated with the punitive expeditions of the Dakota War. And I just quickly wanted to mention Little Crow and Big Eagle. So these two men both had been to Washington. They both were against the war because they had been to Washington. They had seen white people just like grasshoppers. There are so many of them, and they fully understood that if they were to go to arms, they were going to lose. And they didn't support their people taking up arms, and they tried very hard to dissuade them from doing so. One of the most memorable quotes from this period is Little Crow. He had been called a coward, and ultimately that's kind of, laying down the gauntlet for a lot of these men to get them to enlist or to get them to lead. That was what did it. And this is Little Crow's response. "You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of roaring water. You will die like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon. Ta Oyate Duta is not a coward. He will die with you."
So what was life on the prairies back then?
I can give you an example of some of a quote from in here about one of the newly arrived Norwegian immigrants, because as Danielle said, we have the military players, but this is very much a story about the average folks who are just fresh to the Minnesota and moving into the Dakota Territory, and were leaving, looking for opportunity, and coming to this new place, desperate to call it a home, but unfamiliar and confronted with a new landscape they didn't know. So this is a story about one of the main characters who features Ole Paulsen, who runs through the entire narrative, and his reaction to coming to his new hometown after moving through Wisconsin and getting into Minnesota at a place called Carver. So they've just been journeying up the Minnesota River from St. Paul. From there, they drove westward through a rough landscape, in many places hacking their way through the dense forest. At last, they arrived at Carver, the name of Jørgensen's settlement, and located Ole's claim. However, the land was not quite as inviting as it had been when Ole laid claim to it. Quote, "It was so lovely a few months ago. It was so ugly now. The weeds had grown up, and mosquitoes wanted to devour us alive. This was not a place for decent people to be," wrote Ole. Again, he wanted to find another place to settle, but his mother was fed up with moving. And here's her quote. "No, I am traveling no more," she said. "I have traveled enough," end quote. It was useless to protest. Ole's mother got her way, and they stayed in Carver. So there's an example of some of the tensions going on of these folks confronted with a landscape, and that was summer, what happened as through there, and trying to make a new home in a place that was probably not as welcoming as what they felt they'd left.
So was this the kind of the beginning of homesteading? And maybe you could give us a quick timeline of the immigrants, Scandinavian.
Right. So this text is 1862 to 63, but the story of Ole, that he and his family left Norway in 1850, and that's really right in the sort of first big wave. The very first boat left from Norway in 1825, and the first decade from about 1825 to 1830 1835 saw Norwegians primarily looking for religious freedom, leaving the Norwegian state church and coming to the U.S. A bigger wave then happened in the next 30 years, from about 1835 to about 1865, which is going to place us right squarely in the middle of this text. Population of immigrants then dropped off because of tensions with Indians in the Midwestern states, and of course the Civil War. And then that was really also the time of America fever, which I can talk about in a second. But then moving into the mass migration and mass exodus from Norway from about then the 1865 to up to World War I, actually, with the bulk of those folks coming in the 1860s and 70s, and then the largest numbers in the 1880s and 1890s. But at this time of America fever, going back to the 1850s when we were talking about that, there were folks who came in that first wave from 1825 and sent sort of land of milk and honey letters back, and one of those was Ole Rynning, who gets quoted in this text as well. And Ole, as one of the most literate in his family, was the one who read and memorized this letter of an early pamphlet that he had published. And he said, because he was most skilled at reading, Ole read the letter aloud to the family. Quote, "I read that remarkably long letter over and over again, so I almost knew it by heart. Everyone who came to our house had to have the chance to hear Kandidat Rynning's letter." And it goes on to explain, and his father is bitten by America fever then, and transplants the family and moves them off to the States.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're starting to run out of time, but what was the eventual outcome of the war?
Well, for the U.S., it was victory, but for the Dakota, it was dispossession and desolation and disease and starvation, as they were herded essentially like cattle south to St. Paul, to Fort Snelling in particular. There was an island where they were kept, and more than a quarter of the people who surrendered in 1862 died within that first year. On a more hopeful note, in 2005, there was a spiritual leader named Jim Miller who started a memorial horseback ride from Lower Brule, South Dakota, 330 miles to Mankato, Minnesota. And they do this every year. It takes about a week. And they do this in the dead of winter and blizzards and sub-zero weather in order to arrive at Mankato on the anniversary, December 26th, of the largest mass execution in U.S. history, when the 38 were hanged. So that is the outcome. However, that particular ride is one of resilience and hopefulness, and so.
Okay. What's been the reaction to the book so far?
Fascination and surprise. I think folks who didn't know the story or didn't know the story in its entirety, and seeing again, I think our original sense of feeling like Skarstein had a story to tell as an outsider, looking in on a very heated conflict, stepping away from just the military perspectives on it, stepping away, running the red thread through with the immigrant voices. This is one of a series of stories. German immigrants also played a large role in this conflict in the town of New Ulm, for example. So a recent German translation of similar stories of that account, and then now Norwegian translations of some of these accounts, as a way to bring previously unheard voices of this conflict to the fore. So we've had good reactions so far with the text.
Well, if people are interested in getting more information or they want to purchase the book, where can they go? Who can they contact?
We worked with the digital press at the University of North Dakota, so it's actually available at digitalpress.org as a free download. If you want the paper copy, then you actually can, there's a print by demand function that you can get through Amazon, but it's also available in several local North Dakota bookstores.
Yeah, it's in Rugby at Backstage Books and Prairie Village Museum, and at Minot, at Main Street Books.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Stay tuned for more. Minnesota has a passion for beer, from the first ales brewed by settlers to the modern craft beer movement. We spoke with historian Doug Hoverson and Minnesota brewers to learn about how beer has changed over time.
Year for beer, I think Minnesota can hold its own with any place in the world. Minnesota has an outstanding reputation nationally among the brewing community.
All the amazing craft breweries we've got, even seen as being very cool and upcoming on a national level.
You have a pretty healthy German population that put Minnesota pretty rock solid into the beer category.
More than 350 breweries have opened their doors for business, starting in 1849. Of course, about 275 of them also closed their doors to business. The first brewers were early settlers who came out here and decided they needed a couple of things. One, something safe to drink, and also something with a little bit of flavor. Beer has the benefit of being boiled in the course of its manufacture, and that makes it safe to drink.
We are the second oldest family-owned brewery in the country. So the Schell story starts in 1828. August Schell is born in Durbach, Germany. Makes his way to the United States. There he meets his wife, Teresa, and in talking with some friends, they hear about this settlement of New Ulm in the territory of Minnesota. So they pack up the wagon, they head up north, but in a town of Germans and no brewery, it's not hard to figure out what you should be doing.
The Germans brought the tastes of their home country and also the cultures of their home country, because the beer garden and the beer hall were not just a place to have beer. They were a place to meet, to listen to music, to talk about politics, and all of these things were lubricated by a well-made lager beer.
There was no refrigeration. There really wasn't much take-home beer. I mean, if you were going to drink, you went to the saloon.
Anti-alcoholism had been advancing for quite a while, but the timing for them was perfect, and you probably would not have had Prohibition were it not for the fact that we were at war with Germany, and you could make the claim that if you buy a beer, the money is probably going straight to the Kaiser.
Before Prohibition, breweries were in most cases local and a lot smaller, and there were breweries all across the country, little ones here and there.
If it was a small family firm, they'd probably be able to keep the bills paid by making some other products on the side. But near beer was not particularly close to beer unless you were a bad judge of distance.
They used to say that the only good near beer was one that tastes good when you respiked it, because that's what everybody did with near beer. So
the Germans of Minnesota just could not believe that this insanity would last forever. So they kept planning for the days when it would come back. April 7th, 1933 is New Beer's Day. There were parties in nearly every city that had gotten their liquor licenses passed in time. They were allowed to begin shipments at 12:01 a.m. Trucks were ready, train cars were ready, factory whistles blew, in some cities church bells rang, but there were some close calls as people scrambled to get their beer. So during the war, there were a number of stories about troops halfway around the world who ended up going to the PX, getting a beer, and it turned out to be the beer from their hometown. So it was great for morale. They also decided it was great for morale at home as well. America cemented its taste for light-colored, light-flavored lager. During the 1950s and 60s, there were a number of brewers who said publicly that what they were trying for was a sweeter, lighter beer to appeal to the tastes of people who had been raised on soda pop.
The whole nationwide business climate had changed a lot, and there was a lot more consolidation, and breweries just grew bigger and bigger, and also started watering down their products to make them more appealing to a larger number of people.
And so it was harder and harder to distinguish between Schell's, Pabst, Miller, Hamm's, Grain Belt. So the competition gets down to pricing and advertising.
When you were thinking about Minnesota beer in the 1960s and 70s, you were thinking about Grain Belt, Schmidt, or especially Hamm's. As great as the Hamm's beer was, it didn't necessarily sell more beer. Their peak production and their peak ranking was actually before the Hamm's beer became internationally famous. And when Miller went national with Light, they advertised at just an extraordinary rate, and almost no other brewer in the country could keep up.
You know, the consumer then all of a sudden gets tired and is looking for something new. At the start of the craft beer revolution, well, what's new in the United States? Well, ales.
What's happening in the beer world now is really a return plus The craft brewers of Minnesota have gone significantly past resurrecting the styles and have started to tweak them and add their own twists. A brewer in 1880 would have never thought of trying to get a pale ale that had a melon mango sort of flavor and aroma. It was supposed to taste like beer. Minnesota's beer drinkers are discovering how much variety there is in that one four-letter word.
Well, that's all we have for Prairie Pulse this week, and as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.